Welcome to this episode of Kingology with your host Mark. I'm joined today by a host from the Stinking Paws podcast, Charlie. Hi Charlie.
Hello Mark, how you doing?
Not bad, thanks. Now, I just want to talk about your podcast for a little, just to sort of pimp it for you and give you a chance to pimp it yourself. I thoroughly recommend the Stinking Paws podcast. It's a very good, it's not a competitor of ours. We're sort of more low rent exploitation kind of stuff, although occasionally we veer into the classics such as The Seventh Samurai, but we're quite happy, watching The Punisher and Flash Gordon and stuff like that. But I thoroughly recommend Stinking Paws. Would you like to tell the listeners a bit more about your podcast, Charlie?
Oh yeah, well thanks very much for your kind praise. And as you say, what me and Scott, what we do with the show is we tend to look at classics, and I think one of the reasons we started out really is because even though we had similar taste, I needed a bit of an education with some of the older films. And we tend to have an unwritten rule where we don't review anything that came out in the last decade, which kind of gives us an opportunity to review the true classics, I would say.
The established ones, certainly,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. That's a pretty solid rule. There's a couple of podcasts that kind of use that as a metric. Not just for classics, but just say we do ones older than this one. 10 years seems a good cut-off, yes. And most recently you've done stuff like The Godfather, which was a... Really, I was a contributor on that, so I can say it was excellent.
Yeah, it was a great piece that you contributed to that, especially about the more. I think some of the things we tend to miss out are like the technical side of filmmaking because we're not very knowledgeable on it, and it was really helpful to get someone who knew something about that talking on the show. Really.
Yeah, it was also my chance to pimp a bit of Bride of Frankenstein because I love me some Universal films.
Oh yeah, and that might come up. Discussion today as well, I think.
It may well do, yes. Right, we'll get into this. This is number 11 in the Kingology series. I've covered 10 so far. These are in chronological order, but they also include when's King is published under the Richard Bachman author title. So I think it's probably about the 7th in terms of published by King. However, it's his first non-fiction piece. So quite a radical sort of thing for King at the time. I'm guessing he was kind of well established at this point. He'd given up all sorts of things, his teaching and so on, to become a writer. He was a professional writer at this point, but he decided to do a non-fiction piece about the nature of horror because of one of the things he sort of mentions, I think, in the preface is he keeps getting asked about horror, so he wanted to put it all in writing. Have you got any sort of general comments about this particular book?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I was looking forward to it because about a year ago I first read On Writing, which is a much later publication. But I was so impressed with it, really. I mean, I've read quite a few of his novels already, but I was intrigued about the fact that he could write at such length on the process of writing itself. But here we get a more sort of fine-tuned element to it where he's talking about the type of genre that he usually sticks to. And I think you're right to sort of mention that he was established by this point, because a lot of what he seems to do here is not just answer the questions about why do people pay good money to go and be made to feel uncomfortable by reading or watching a horror film, but also sort of responding to what some of the critics have said about his own work.
Yeah. Just to go back to On Writing, that is a wonderful piece of work. It's a very interesting mix of autobiography and advice for writers, which he has similar advice in this book. His advice is basically work hard, and on Writing he covers that point again and again, as well as more specific sort of tips and stuff. That is a great piece of work. Did you read On Writing first, or did you read...
I did actually. This is a first time read for me.
Right. Okay.
Purely because I think On Writing was one of the more established things in terms of you don't need to even be a Stephen King fan to have that book on your shelf.
And there's definitely some interesting autobiographical pieces in that as well. I haven't read it in about 5 or 6 years, but I still remember certain bits of it quite distinctly. And I've always fancied myself as a bit of a writer, though I've never had anything published. So I always found it a really useful practical work as well, actually.
Yeah, I think it's great. It put me on to a few other writers as well. He mentions people like Elmore Leonard and people like that in the book, and I think it should just go down as a great piece of non-fiction, regardless of whether you're into horror or not.
I agree. I'm kind of looking forward to it, but I think it's probably several. I'm trying to do one of these chronologically, one a month, so it's going to be like 5 years before I get back onto that. But I'll tap you up for coming on when I get to that. Okay, well, let's get on to Danse Macabre. So he kind of basically he's trying to analyse this whole subject of horror in this book, but he doesn't do it in a linear, dry sort of educational way. He does it in this sort of languorous, casual style that King seems to be really good at, in my opinion. What do you think of the whole sort of style of the book?
I think it's very consistent with the way that he writes fiction. King always says that he never plots. He just lets the story come to him. He sits down, starts writing. And here there is a bit of a meandering sense to it, but it works. And I think part of the reason as well is because he mentions late on in the book that he doesn't really want it to be a text. He doesn't want it to be an academic study. He wants it to be accessible to everyone.
Yeah, it certainly isn't a text. I mean, one of the I just to give perspective on this, I read this I think probably in the late 80s for the first time, and I've read it maybe 6 or 7 times since. I've even got it on an audio, quite a good audio book came out of it about a year ago. And bizarrely, it came out just at the time I thought, I really fancy reading Danse Macabre. I'm doing a lot of driving. I wonder if it's out on audio. And I checked, and it basically had come out the day before I looked, which was, that means I have to buy it. It's literally just come out. It's quite a good listen as well. It's not read by King, but it's in... You can tell the reader of the audiobook is in tune with King, and it expresses him quite well. So I've read this several times, and I can see it's become a little out of time with some of it. Certainly, some of his choices of films now, which work much better in the late 80s. But what are we 30 years plus since then, so it's kind of feels a bit. It definitely feels dated in some respects, but in others, it's just. To me, it feels like you're spending a lot of time with a really fine sort of after dinner speaker talking about a subject he loves, and you love to listen to or read him. That's how the whole book feels to me, really.
Yeah, I don't think you could really get a better individual to speak on the topic. He might not be people's favourite horror writer, but I think you'd have a hard time arguing against the case that he's the foremost writer in that genre of the last 40 years. So
yeah, I mean, he stands alone, really. I mean, there's been some that come and go. I mean, we get Clive Barkers and stuff like that, which are very fine, but in terms of consistent, his books are so damn. They feel real. They feel real, and reading this is non-fiction. It feels like you're sitting there listening to him, talking to you. When he writes characters and when he writes non-fiction, it just makes sense. It just really makes sense. I think some of the ideas explored in the book are really wonderful as well. I mean, I do like the opening section where he talks about Sputnik. Being a little kid in a movie theatre and the manager telling them about Sputnik, and the kids all just sitting there silently, realising that America might not be the greatest nation in the world. That's kind of you almost feel like you're there.
Yeah, I love that. I love the fact that it sort of coincides with his realisation that finally these sort of science fiction films are going to turn a bit nasty as well.
Yeah.
It seems as if when America still has a chance of winning the space race, you've got things like the Earth, the day the Earth stood still, when the aliens are going to come and extend friendship to the human race. As soon as Russia get on the scene, it's all a bit, the saucers are going to come and attack us, really.
Yeah, Earth vs Flying Saucers was an appropriate film to be watching when we got that announcement. It's kind of fun. He also, I also found it kind of interesting. He took quite a bit of time slating these various pop psychologists that tried to analyse him. So, you know, what makes him tick? You know, why does he keep writing about horror? And he tells stories about, you know, when he was a boy. He told a story at someone asking him about when he was a boy. He must have witnessed someone being hit and killed by a train, but he has no memory of it. And they sort of said, "Oh yeah, but you've been writing about it ever since." And he thinks it's like horseshit, doesn't he? It's like, yeah, you can say that, but that's just nonsense, really. He took a fair bit of time having a swing at such individuals in a sort of happy way, not in a sort of like bitter or anything way. He just thought it was like shrugging his shoulders, saying, "Look at this." People look for silly, simplistic answers to complex things, and then he goes on to explain exactly why he thinks horror's important, and really nails it actually.
I think he's spot on with that when he's saying about these sort of pop psychologists shooting from the hip.
Yeah,
I think that totally disregards the fact that he has a wonderful imagination and a great gift. I mean, it's really kind of offensive to claim that it's turned out to be this great storyteller purely because of some tragic incident that happened in his childhood that, as you say, he doesn't even remember anyway.
Yeah. I always think of King as almost being a modern day sort of Charles Dickens in that he just constructs really, really good story. In fact, I think it's better than Dickens actually. He constructs really good stories, but his characterisation is almost second to none. And it becomes really obvious when you read his non-horror stories, you know, like The Body, Stand By Me, or Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption story, where the horror's not part of it, but he's still writing really fantastic stuff. He just has this amazing ability to do that. And yeah, you're right. It's silly to think, oh well, he does that because of this. It's because he's a damn good writer, and he obviously loves his craft because he spends so much time at it. And he's a big believer in working hard as well, isn't he? So that sort of ties into it. He does develop some great ideas that, on reading, have always stuck with me when I think about horror. He talks about the 3 levels of horror, for example, and explores that in a really nice way.
That was a great. Well, one of the things I liked that was the way he introduced it, because he retells the famous horror story that's never been written down of the Hook, and I remember hearing like a derivation of that story when I was on a caravanning holiday at about the age of 7.
Yeah.
I think like all the parents were in the clubhouse or whatever, and we were sitting outside on this sort of summer's evening, all us kids, and one of the older children told us this story, and at the time I thought I'd done a fairly convincing job of pretending not to be absolutely terrified.
Yeah.
But on reflection, and when I read King's Passage, it's pointless. You realise that the whole point of that story is to terrify small children, and it's that first sort of glorious instance of true terror that you get from fiction as a kid that you're never going to let go, really.
Yeah. It also, I mean, he does talk about there's some things that you don't need characterisation or, story. There's some visceral things that just will scare you or gross you out or whatever. He talks, for example, later on about some old film involving spiders where it's a bad film, but there's one point a big fat spider falls into a blender and then a woman drinks it. And he says, it doesn't matter about the characterisation, it's like at the visceral level, that's going to get to you. And the Hook is kind of that way at a psychic level, isn't it? It just gets to you. I often the 3 levels of horror which he discusses. I hear back now again and again through different podcasts and different writers that idea of the sort of all these 3 levels. It's obvious that a lot of people have read this book because I hear it all over the place. A couple of times a year, people coming back to this. So I think that key idea of this, terror. If you can't achieve terror, you get to horror, where you see the monster rather than imagine it, and then the gross out where something, the monster vomits all over you or whatever it is. I hear it again and again, and I'm a big podcast listener, and I hear it for various different things, and as I say, I read it in places too. So this idea, I think this book's been quite influential in the way it's made some people think about horror. It certainly, the first time I read it, that stuck with me and it never left my mind in terms of thinking about how horror's constructed in both films and books, really. I remember the first time I read it, it was almost like a revelation, Road to Damascus. Oh yeah, that's how horror works. It makes sense. Did you get anything like that from the book?
No, I absolutely got that. But one thing I should say is that I'm not the biggest watcher of horror films, and one thing this book has done is it's going to make me go and revisit some of the ones that I've ignored, and even try and reinterpret the ones that I have seen. The whole thing that you'll probably get onto soon about this idea of horror movies as junk food really does show you the importance of the ones that you'd previously sort of disregard as being quite disposable films.
That's probably the second big idea I took from this book, the horror movie. In fact, the genre movie as junk food. I now always think of cinema, and probably it goes on to other things like TV, that it's a great analogy. Food, there's fine dining and there's junk food, and you can't fine dine all the time because you lose your appreciation of it. You got to have a greasy burger now and again, so that a really good meal is what it is, rather than just have it all the time. I find that's true of books and TV, and as well as movies. It's a great idea as well, and the fact he called the chapter that is kind of bold, isn't it? Just to make his point, it's kind of cool. He also talks about the horror tarot in a kind of interesting way. Which is, he basically thinks there's only certain primal archetypes that operate in horror, and he introduces them in terms of works of fiction. He talks about the vampire, the werewolf, and the thing. The vampire being Dracula, the werewolf is Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and he has some great stories about the writing of that book too. And the thing being Frankenstein's monster. The novel Frankenstein. He introduces others later, but those are like the three sort of key ones. And he talks about different films. It's interesting that the werewolf isn't a werewolf story or a film. It is Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, but that makes more sense. It's a more classic piece of work. And I remember reading this the first time made me go and read those books. I think I'd read Dracula already at that point, but I did go and read those books after reading this. I did find this work very inspirational. I don't know if you felt the same way reading it this time, but it did make me. I read a lot of the books he's talked about in this book ever since I read it.
Yeah, I've got post-it notes everywhere actually with names like Peter Straub, and I knew about I 11 already. Yeah. Rosemary's Baby being absolutely massive as a film and a book, but people like Richard Matheson and Harlan Ellison and Ramsey Campbell, who might have been a lot bigger in 1981 than they are now too. I think I'm going to have to go and revisit.
They weren't that big back then. I think no. In fact, they weren't really. They kind of had their heyday in the early 70s. Right. I remember it fairly distinctly. I had to hunt down. It was kind of. I had trouble getting hold of I Am Legend back then. It's easier to get now. In fact, it's dead easy to get stuff now with Kindles and stuff. But they. I think Straub was definitely a current one.
Yeah,
for sure. But Matheson and so on were kind of had already had their heyday. Harlan Ellison's always kind of been there as a constant, but never a big seller the way say King is. But Harlan Ellison's always been there, and he's been well regarded. Been so tied into some great Star Trek stories. So the genre people definitely know Harlan Ellison, and I think his level of sort of fame, if you like, was the same then as probably now.
Right. Okay.
Maybe that's a bit more then.
Actually, I mean, obviously James Herbert died a couple of years ago. Shirley Jackson, I think that was the. Was that the house, something like
House on Haunted Hill.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of archetypal one that I'm going to go out and get first, because the way he describes that, he talks about it as the prose being sort of up there with anything he's encountered in English literature. So you can't really get a better praise than that. I've got to go and seek those sort of things out, I think.
Indeed, I haven't read Ghost Story yet, but this book reminded me. I keep meaning to, and I just haven't. But I've read quite a lot of the other ones he's mentioned, and for example, Shirley Jackson. I think he I can't remember for sure, but I think he covers the first paragraph to that work about Hill House, which is a really wonderful piece of writing, and it made me go read the book, and I really did like that book. It was good. And I've also read The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, which I do believe was quite an influence on King's Long Walk as well. They're thematically, and the sort of nature of the story is very similar. So that's a short story, so if you try and catch that too, I think you'd enjoy that. I think it's either free or you can find it online, like for 30 pence on Kindle or something like that. It's well worth it. I do remember this book, and reading it again, it makes you just want to go and read, doesn't it?
Devour everything that he mentions, really. Yes. I mean, I don't know if you've got sort of like the latest edition, or if it's included in the older editions, but there are 2 appendices at the back where he lists about 100 films and 100 books.
He does, yes, he does, yes.
You know, I feel like printing them out and just sticking them on the wall, really, and constantly going back and referring to all of the ones that he's highlighted.
Yeah, it is funny. I'm not a big... I mean, I used to be a big reader, but these days not so much. But I am a big film watcher, and I always... We'll probably get into this. I always feel like his choice of films were very narrow compared to the field of horror. You know, I've watched a lot of horror films. Whereas literature, I'm not sure. And I always wonder, is someone who's a big reader, would they look at his list and think, oh, that's a very narrow... I don't know enough about books to know. I just think he's listed some great works, and I've read a lot of them. One of the favourites of mine is Shrinking Man, The Incredible Shrinking Man. I was inspired to read it by this book, and I really, really think it's a good book. But it is funny. King says more about the book than I think Matheson thinks of the book. You know, King imbues it with more meaning than I think Matheson ever intended or really cares to. And it's kind of interesting. King sees all these things, and when I read the works I can see them, but Matheson either didn't intend them to be there or doesn't particularly care anymore. It's kind of that shows some King's imparting some interesting insights there.
And he quotes Richard Gere Powers as well, doesn't he, at length, about how he thinks that, you know, the book, a bit like The Body Snatchers as well, is about depersonalisation, and how it makes a lot of sense in that McCarthyism era of like communism's going to take over. And it's weird, isn't it? Because like at times King really tries to say this is not an academic text. You know, we're taking things at face value. I think he does a bit of a disservice to himself when he does that, because he does go so in depth.
He does sometimes undercut himself, really, because I think he knows he's a target, and he'll say and he'll say things like, some of my critics say I can publish my laundry list and still sell, and who knows, they might be right. You know, he's undermining himself a little, which is fine. You know, I kind of understand that. You don't want to be pompous when you're talking about these kind of things, but he does do himself a disservice. He presents some things in a really interesting way. There's certainly some horror films which as I say, I've watched lots of horror films, good, bad, and some of the ones he picks on, I think, why on earth would he talk about that? But the thing is, he explains exactly why he talks about those. You know, for example, he talks about prophecy. He explains exactly why he's picking on that film and why he wants to talk about it, and I respect him for that. I think there are better films he could have chosen to make his points, but I'm not going to argue. You know, I wouldn't argue with him about it. He explains exactly why he's picked on that film and what he took from it and stuff like that. It's fine. It's kind of cool. But I know that his range of films is kind of very American centric and very sort of narrow in time. But then again, he did say it's only going to be the last 30 years, so fair enough, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Prophecy's an interesting one. I've since sort of looked it up. I'm going to watch it soon.
It's sorry. Go on.
Sorry. Everything about it sounds atrocious, other than what Stephen King says. To be honest.
Yeah, it's only really worth seeing. I might watch it. I haven't watched it in many, many years, and I didn't like it when I did see it. But I think I may have even watched it before I read the book. That's how long ago I watched it. But I'll probably watch it again just to see. You know, he makes an interesting case about watching the weird, peculiar babies they find. I just want to see that for myself. But I wouldn't just watch that bit. I'd watch the whole film. You know. I also like the little. It's just when he talks about like Dracula, he just makes you want to read it. You know, he makes you want to read it again. Like, explains what the sexuality around Dracula is all about, and it's kind of funny and interesting. I also like he develops this idea of like, which comes from the werewolf tarot card, which kind of then imbues the rest of the book, which is he talks about the conflict between the Apollonian nature of man and Dionysian nature of man, and like that imbues every film he then talks about. Really, that particular point, and it's kind of again it once I've got that in my head, you know, after reading it many years ago, it kind of never leaves me that's what many horror films seem to be about. Especially if you watch something like The Exorcist, when he talks about that, yeah, that's exactly what it's about.
I think the Apollonian and Dionysian thing is so central, isn't it, as you say?
Yeah.
Because it also backs up one of the early points that he makes and keeps reiterating that, you know, when he's asked that question, why do you want to make up horrible things when there is so much real horror in the world? His response is really simple and effective at the same time. And he says that by creating these horrors, we're actually helping people to cope with the real ones. And not only, you know, do they sort of invert real horrors, made up horrors seem to be even more popular when things are bad in society at the time. So it's sort of like people want to watch a horror film so they can see the Apollonian things returning from Dionysian circumstances, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, he comes up with a great example of that. He says The Exorcist did really well in America because it was kind of the young versus old thing that was really rampant in America, you know, in the early 70s. He says, whereas in Germany, the film that went through the roof was Dawn of the Dead, which, you know, zombies and attacking society, and Germany at the time had like the Baader Meinhof gang and sort of terrorism to deal with. So you know their particular the horror films that put bombs on seats in Germany reflected that, you know, whereas say The Exorcist wouldn't. So it's kind of you can see that's almost direct evidence for what he's saying, and it kind of just makes sense what he says. He does talk about phobic points, doesn't he, later on as well? Phobic, you know, the phobic pressure points and what scare. You know, some people are scared of spiders and you know something like that. And he does come back to it, but coming back to the hook, he does come back to the fact that the probably the master phobic point for everyone is darkness, which he then talks about many books dealing with darkness, like for example, I'm trying to think the one actually. No, he talks about some films about concerning darkness, but it's kind of this idea of phobic points is another great idea he introduces in this book.
Well, that's something that's slightly more inexplicable, isn't it, phobia? Because
yes,
that's when you can't really have the Apollonian and the Dionysian things. It's like I'm petrified of spiders, but it's not so much that because I think spiders are going to do me harm and that they are Dionysian. It is just like an irrational sort of fear that I can't explain. And I think that's something that comes across really well in King's other work too. He does pick up on what scares people without much explanation being available.
It kind of, when you start thinking about it, kind of equates sort of the primitiveness of the response relating to the three levels of horror. It's almost like the gross out is the one that is the, you know, the dinosaur, the reptile brain in us all. You know, to be grossed out, doesn't require thought. It's just a reaction. But then, as you get to more thoughtful stages of mind, you know, then the Dionysian Apollonian thing comes in, and also, you know, horror and terror and the balances of that. It's kind of the more cerebral it gets, the sort of more you're creeping towards terror as your phobic pressure. Whereas the more primitive, the more primitive things like a gross monster vomiting on you or something like that is really a sort of gut reaction.
The chest burster scene in Alien's a really good example, I think.
Yes, excellent example. Yeah, and a lot of John Carpenter's The Thing too. They're just gross things. There's no thinking about it; you just react. Indeed. He also he was really inspired me to start reading H.P. Lovecraft as well. In this book, he talks about Lovecraft being like the sort of colossus that informed horror around the 80s and before, and I could kind of see it though. I've read a fair bit of Lovecraft, but there's only some really good stuff in Lovecraft, in my opinion. But most of it's very readable. It's just not great necessarily. Is Lovecraft on your list?
Lovecraft's definitely on my list. He's a bit like Ray Bradbury for me in the fact that they've had this massive influence on the field of fantasy and horror, but they kind of separated themselves from it on a personal level. They saw themselves as much higher literary types, which I think is a little bit pompous, but I think they are regarded for some of the other work they've done as well as what they contributed to this field.
Yeah. I'm not. With Lovecraft, I always got the impression. Well, did he? I can't remember if he died mad, but he was always he was an odd fellow, for sure. In fact, even odder was. I think King talks about Robert E. Howard and Conan. He believed Conan stood behind him dictating the stories, which puts a real slant on the stories when you read them, when you realise that's how they came about. It's that's a muse of sorts, I guess.
Was Robert E. Howard the writer as well that he describes as committing suicide just after his mother died?
No, I'm trying to remember if that was Lovecraft or Howard. I think it was Howard, actually.
Yeah, and it sort of gave a new perspective to the fact that he was trying to write himself into this fantasy world where he was really brave and strong and he, defeated monsters, but actually the reality of living without his mother was unbearable for him.
Wow. There is, I guess, always sometimes this link between genius and madness or sort of mental issues, I guess, but that was a shocker. I remember reading the first time I read that, but it didn't make me enjoy the stories less. I have to say, I have read a few of them. I think I even read a few of them because I'd read about this and then, I've got to read some of this guy's stuff just to see what's going on. King also then gets on to I think he talks about how he first got to love horror. He found his father departed when he was very young, or even before he was born, I can't remember now. He found some old books that belonged to his father, and one of them was H.P. Lovecraft. In fact, I think he remembers the front of it with like a green, I can't remember what it was now, but he describes the front of the book, of this H.P. Lovecraft book, and then he was kind of hooked. I think he said he was about 8, if I remember rightly. Which is an interesting, an absent father was the thing that inspired him to his life's work. It's kind of interesting.
There's a really fascinating connection there as well, because later on when he's talking about Ray Bradbury writing his father into one of his stories and not realising it, it was a bit like King describing the fact that even though he never really knew his dad, just inheriting all these texts from him kind of allowed him to live on forever and sort of be relevant to everything he does in his working life.
Yeah. But that Bradbury story also reminded me of the fact that sometimes with King you get the same little weird events happening through several books. The same event happens, so you think that must have happened to him. That must have happened for example, there's an event, I think it was in It, but it was I think it was also in Apt Pupil, where an old tramp offers a young lad a blowjob for a dime.
That's right, yeah.
For example, and you got to think that must have happened to King, because that's a really peculiar thing. And to put it in twice, you'd remember it. If it never happened to you, you wrote it, you'd remember it. But if it did happen to you, you may well forget you've already written it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's funny that you mentioned that as well, about him sort of dismissing him writing about seeing the dead body or someone getting hit by a train, and I can't deny that when I was reading that anecdote in Danse Macabre, it made me think of Stand By Me straight away.
Yes, I mean the kids going to see a dead body. It's kind of, I agree. You think at some level he must remember. I guess he mustn't he, if he witnessed it. But he dismisses it. But there's an awful lot of autobiography in King stuff. You know, how many of his books are about a writer, for example?
Yeah, and I think it's just important to remember that, you know, we're not saying that these are the reasons why he's as good a writer, but I mean, I think even he himself will concede that it's undeniable that some of these elements aren't going to find their way into it.
Yeah, and I think he recognises that, like you say, when he talks about Bradbury, realising he was writing about his father when he wrote about, was it Something Wicked?
Something Wicked This Way Comes, yeah, and I think it was the character of Mr. Halloway, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's one of the few books of the ones he talks about in detail that I haven't read actually, and I've got it on my list to read, and I want to see the film as well. I'm kind of interested to sort of absorb Something Wicked This Way Comes, because I also think the idea of a weird carnival coming to a town and having an influence is kind of an interesting story, you know, and I think it's been done in various films, as you know, in other forms. It's just, I just want to. Bradbury sounds like the best take on it from the way King talks about it, but that's just King. I think when he's enthusiastic about something, he just sells it. He just sells it, and you become as enthusiastic as he does, really.
That's a good way of putting it. I think the enthusiasm just sort of flows off the page, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's just got such an easy style to read and absorb. Like I say, in his fiction stuff, his characters are just very believable. You just feel like you are experiencing someone else, and you know, it is the same with women, boys, men, old men. I'm reading Cujo. I've just started Cujo recently, and he's convincing me that I'm understanding how a dog feels about things. So
yeah,
how does he do that? I don't know.
it's great characterisation, as you say, which makes it all the more surprising when he says at one point that he thinks story's more important than anything. I would argue that he's got certain books where the characterisation is stronger than the plot.
Yes.
I remember listening to your episode on The Shining and being in agreement with what you said. When I went back to reading The Shining myself, the characterisation of Danny is so intelligent and so detailed that it's understandable that you would expect him to be an older child.
Yes. It's just I think King is an expert at characterisation. His stories can be lacking because he doesn't plot. So he's famous for his endings that don't really work and stuff like that. But I think everyone who reads King has kind of accepted that. Unless you're like new to him, you kind of accepted that sometimes the endings don't quite work, or they feel not quite right to the rest of it. But it doesn't matter, because really it's about the journey, not the ending. Really, with King, I think.
Yeah, I think anyone who tries to dispute King's status as a writer is being not just unkind, but probably lying to themselves. I totally accept when someone says, you know, the ending's sloppy, or you know, he's not quite on the ball with this idea for a story. But you know, you just cannot imagine the man doing anything else with his time. He's just as prolific a writer as you're going to get.
Yeah, he's. I mean, I still read King, though. I've started on this chronology. I just haven't got time to read his newer stuff. It's going to just have to wait. I do try. But I have the most recent I've read of his is probably the one about JFK, which is I can never get this right. 11 22 63, something like that.
Yeah, it's of the date of the assassination.
Yeah,
I think that's probably the most recent one.
And I really quite enjoyed that, but that's about as most recent as I've got from him. And it's interesting, it intersects with It, which I found quite fascinating. The kids from It become characters in it for a short part. And I understand Dr. Sleep's supposed to be quite good as well. But
I've got a copy of Dr. Sleep. It was sort of a must-buy, given that it's a sequel to The Shining. But you know, just typical of King. He's already bought out another one before I can even get down to that.
It's amazing. I thought he was going blind, but maybe. Oh, I don't know. Anyway, maybe you can write through it. I don't really know.
He's not had a lot of luck with his health, has he?
No, not with the being hit by the car and all that business. I guess he's lucky that he's alive.
Sure. Yeah.
But I understand his son's doing some wonderful work now as well, so I kind of want to get to that at some point too. Certainly, I heard someone discuss it in his son's work with respect to Horns. You know, the film Horns. That's based on his what's his name? Is it Joe?
Joe King.
Joe King. And I'm kind of interested in Joe King because I've listened recently to a podcast about Horns, the movie Horns, and someone on the I think it was this podcast called the Splattercast. Was talking about some of the really good work that Joe King's doing, so it's kind of interesting that he sounds like he's a bit of a chip off the old block, but quite a talent in his own right too. He's not riding on his dad's coattails as well. You can't if you're a writer. You've got to deliver, haven't you? He sounds like he's doing some good work too, so that'd be kind of interesting.
I need to check that out too as well. But I didn't realise until I read Danse Macabre either that Tabitha King also published work.
Yeah, it mentions one she published about either little people, or shrunken people, or some sort of size, resizing kind of sci-fi, which is interesting. I don't know if it's easy to pick up. I've never seen it on a shelf anywhere. That was I can't remember what it's called. That's the trouble. But I've never seen a name on any sort of shelves in Britain.
I think it was published by Macmillan, so it might be available, but if that isn't, then you might get the sense that she only got the gig because of her husband, unlike Joe.
Yeah, I think Joe, from the sound of it, he's got some really interesting ideas as well, really quite radically different, more like Clive Barker than, say, Stephen King, actually, from the sound of it. King also, he's covered this idea of the three sort of levels of horror, and he's talked about the horror tarot. He also expands quite a bit on the ghost, what he calls the ghost card, though he does talk about the book Turn of the Screw, but he says there's no one book that really represents the ghost card, because there's so many different great books about it. And he also talks at length about Peter Straub's Ghost Story, which it sounds like a really good book as well. And I was trying to remember if I read it or not. But the thing is, what I thought I remembered about it is everything mentioned in this book. So I could be just thinking I've read it and it's in this book.
It's certainly one of the ones I want to check out. He speaks very highly of it. I think the reason he doesn't include the ghost in the tarot is because he says that for him the ghost isn't just exclusive to horror. There are a lot of stories you get where ghosts do nice things and help people and give them warnings about terrible things taking place.
Yeah.
So it's only the instances where these ghosts have like Dyson qualities that you can really put them into a scary story.
Indeed. I mean, another thing he adds to the tarot is, he doesn't put the haunted house in, but he puts the bad place in the tarot, which sounds okay, and then that gives him a chance to talk about The Shining a bit, which is fine by me, really. He then he starts talking about different mediums of horror, and he starts with radio, which, now is, is non-existent really, radio horror. We get audio books and such like, but radio horror doesn't exist really as a medium unless you go back quite a few years just to listen to old ones. Back then there was a bit around. I do remember sitting up and listening to Capital Radio at midnight, because they had like a horror story, 10-minute horror story at midnight. It was called Moment of Terror. So I remember actually sort of participating in radio horror, but it was very sort of slight and infrequent kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've got to be honest, I probably took less from that chapter from any in the book, to be fair, just because it didn't really relate so much to me, my own personal history, and it also felt like a lot more of that stuff was widely available in America too.
Yeah. There wasn't much here. One thing, a point he did make, which I really took on about the radio stuff, is earlier on in the book he talks about in horror you can try and sustain the terror, but at some point you really do need to deliver something. You know, you can't just sustain terror, and usually 99 times out of 100 is a disappointment because people are relieved. You know, because, you know, even if you deliver something disgusting, they're going to think, well, at least it isn't twice as disgusting as that. You know, so while you don't see it, there's this there's, you know, terror or suspense, but once you see the thing and it's horror, it's kind of there's a relief and often a bit of a letdown. But he does mention that radio kind of by its nature can pull that trick because you don't see it, you just hear the reactions of people. So it's kind of, it's an interesting medium from that sense, but in terms of modern life it really doesn't relate to much anything that in terms of, you know, people listening. Having said that, I did see recently apparently Ted Raimi's got some idea to generate some what equivalent to radio horror via webcasts. So
in a weird way it feels like radio is becoming slightly more relevant than it was in 1981, I think, because I think the advent of podcasts have helped that as well. And, you know, Radio 4 and things like that, they do put across some really good stuff when they read out fiction. It's just, I think King is writing this book from a time when TV is yet to actually reach its zenith, so radio is completely going out of the picture, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, radio, I mean, it is definitely, I think, the most dated section in the book, really, in terms of what a modern reader can take from it. Next section, it gets into his horror movies, which is, I think we started talking about, didn't we? We talked about horror as junk food. He mentions societal phobias, which I've already mentioned, in terms of, like, you know, West Germany, Dawn of the Dead did pretty well. But then he also starts listing different types of horror, and then I find it kind of interesting. And they're very 70s. Is mentioned, like he talks about Amityville horror being like a financial horror as well as a sort of familial horror. It's kind of cool. And then he talks about techno horror and stuff like that, which was a big thing in the 50s and kind of started to die out for more sort of personal horror, I think.
I like the fact that he starts to talk about death in the, you know, because in the 70s he mentions that, you know, violent television is on the decline, but it means that in the cinema you're going to get it with both barrels. And at one point he says if he had to restrict everything he had ever said or written about the horror genre to just a single statement, it would be death is when the monsters get you. And I think that's what really starts to come through in films like the Amityville Horror and The Exorcist and The Omen, because they can just be so more shocking because they've got that freedom, haven't they?
Yeah, it's indeed. As I say, he does pick some kind of what I would consider kind of idiosyncratic, very mainstream American kind of horror films, but I guess that's what he watches, you know, so it's kind of different. That's what you're going to get. I do like some of his picks, though, in the horror as junk food, though. I think he gets a really interesting point about how all these... It's when he focuses on a particular film, I think we've kind of already covered this, but when he focuses on a particular film and says, yeah, this is junk, but this little bit in it really has something about it that makes you shudder. You know, be it the Prophecies, Weird Babies or whatever. And I really take a lot from that. And I think that's true of almost any medium and any genre. You know, there's something that you can really take from... You know, a terrible bit of telly. There might be one bit in it you think, that's a really good bit, you know. But for some reason, films, that works better for films, you know. There's often one piece of it you think, that's the bit. And often it comes to, have you seen the film Where? And you say that bit. And that's how people identify those films.
No, definitely. It's there's also a film he mentions in that section about... I think it's something, I Married a Creature from Outer Space or something like that.
I Married a Monster from Outer Space. Yeah.
That's right. And he talks about a scene where, you know, he says it's fairly tame, it's not that good, but he said there's one section where the groom goes out onto the balcony to have a cigarette and there's a flash of lightning where you see the transparency of his face, and he says it's genuinely horrific. And King probably wouldn't approve of me doing this, considering what he says about turning to the end of a book. But I had to Google image the film just to see what that person's face was like, and that looked really quite disturbing for that type of cinema.
Yeah. I actually did see that film when I was about 9 or 10, so I'd seen the film before I read that section, so I knew exactly what he was. Spot on. That's exactly how I felt when I saw the film. I actually quite like that film, but I haven't seen it in many years. But the lightning strike is the bit that makes you jump, because you don't expect it, for one, and then you've got to think about, even at 9 or 10, I thought, it's going to go with that woman now.
Yeah.
And she doesn't know. And also that film actually works for me personally. At the end, there's an attack with involving Alsatians ripping into them, which you don't often see in films. Dogs ripping into the bodies of some, they're aliens, but they're still bodies. So
it's usually when you get an old film and you get something quite revolutionary in it like that, because they mentioned the specific part of the Night of the Hunter that I remember mentioning to Scott, and it's when the bride, the woman that Robert Mitchum has recently married, is in the car underwater with, like, you just see her hair flailing about the water. And I found it quite weird that King picked up on that specifically himself as well. I just remember being absolutely chilled by that.
Yeah, that's a brilliant film with many bits like that, but that is a really memorable piece of that film. Having said that, there's lots of great bits in that film, but that bit is like, when he talks about it, it's like, I think that also inspired me to watch that film. Though I've watched it several times since. Another thing I can thank sort of Stephen King for sort of introducing me to.
And that's the thing as well, because The Night of the Hunter, I imagine its critical reception still have a lot of stock in 1981. Now it's a massive film, and I can only assume that things like Danse Macabre contributed to its reputation greatly.
Yeah. He mentions lots of things. One thing he mentions is how much he hates Plan 9 from Outer Space, which I kind of don't agree with him with. But I do agree with him when he says he hates people that are just laughing at it for the sake of laughing at it. Sometimes it does feel a bit cruel. Though, you've got to balance these things. I think watching something that's just wretched just for a laugh is a bit pointless, personally. But I've done it myself, but I always still hope to see something worth seeing, and often it'll be, wow, look at that was a great bit in this terrible film, and I like to point out the good bits in bad films too.
Well, just in reference to what you're saying, I really like the mining analogy that he uses, that you get films like Alien or Jaws that you can just sort of pluck out of nowhere, and there's not a lot of hard work to it. But if you're a true horror film aficionado, you've got to sort of go through all the dirt and just look for the bright spots, the gold dust every now and then, and your reward is finding, if not a decent film, at least a decent passage in an otherwise quite appalling.
There is definitely there's nothing more fun. Not so much with horror these days, but I often find genre films that everyone else seems to hate that I really like, and I get a certain perverse pleasure out of finding out, and I'll be a sort of a cheerleader for that film whenever I can be, but I have to really like it. I don't just do it to be contrary. It's something that and there are films like that around. So it's a real pleasure to find a good film that no one else seems to think is good.
No, that's right. I think part of the value of that as well is a lot greater in this day and age, because when King's writing in 1981, he's talking about a lot of the bad films being the cheap exploitation ones. Now I think horror's entered a sort of a kind of landscape where a lot of the really bad ones are the ones with the biggest budgets, actually.
Yeah. It's most big budget horror films. I think comedy and horror don't benefit from a big budget. They benefit from creativity and talent. You can't just throw money at them and think it get funnier or get scarier. It doesn't work like that. Which is one of the reasons I particularly like horror and comedy. I think it's kind of nice.
Yeah, I think as well as why King himself even talks about having great admiration for things like the Blair Witch Project and Cloverfield that showed that you could make something genuinely disturbing and really quite revolutionary with not a lot of money.
Yeah. I I always pay attention when I find that King particularly likes a piece of work. Though I often don't agree with him, you know, when he says, "Oh, this is really good and this one isn't so good." I feel like he's got a very sort of narrow view of horror, but we won't get into that too much now. It's just I'd still pay attention. For example, I've got on my list to watch. He mentions that he thinks that the remake of The Last House on the Left was a particularly good horror film. Now, the original I find a terrible film, but I'm kind of interested to see this remake because I want to see if King's hit the nail on the head or if he's wrong. You know, I'm just interested because I still his opinion still means a lot to me, even though I don't agree with him a lot about films. One area I do agree with him though is TV actually. Now again, this is quite a dated section. He does talk about TV at quite some length, and I was always a fan of The Outer Limits, and it was not, and I watched quite a lot of The Outer Limits before I read this book. So it kind of, one of the reasons this book I think gelled with me so much is that this guy really gets The Outer Limits, and he does go on about it, but it is quite old now. And so I think his TV stuff hasn't aged so well because we've had so much good TV since, and it's kind of easy to think, you know, there's the X-Files probably is the most significant in terms of straight out horror, but you know, things like Twin Peaks, which definitely has a horror elements and things like that, whereas he's talking about, you know, the Thriller, which is really old now, Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, Night Stalker, stuff like that, some of which were definitely influences on more recent things like the X-Files. Let's talk about the X-Files being a recent thing. It's bloody 20 years old or something now, isn't it?
But it's coming back at least.
Yeah, it's coming back. And Twin Peaks, hopefully. It definitely, he had some interesting mentions. It's very American centric for sure. Apart from, I think he talks about the BBC's version of Dracula. He does mention that, but otherwise it's pretty much American kind of shows he talks about. Some of which I really like. I mean, I'll watch Night Gallery now, you know, and that's from the early 70s. I really like that. You got any comments about the TV section?
Yeah, well, I remember sort of when I was reading the section, I did make a note that you covered really well, actually. That you're sort of sitting there reading it and you're questioning, has too much time gone past since he wrote this book for the television section to be applicable, because there has been like this, as you say, this cataclysmic rise in programs like the X-Files and Twin Peaks, and even I think there's one on at the moment that I still haven't seen called American Horror Story that people are sort of lapping up, and it just seems, I think another point of it as well is that he's writing at a time when TV's been massively censored because some of the things that had happened in the 70s, so he's disadvantaged that he didn't get to update it from there.
Yeah, he does he? I'm trying to think. He talks about a particular reason why censorship came in, wasn't it? I can't remember what it is now.
There was a film, I think it was called Fuzz or something, starring Burt Reynolds, and it featured a group of teenagers that went round setting alight to sort of drunks and tramps and things like that. And there was an incident in America where a young girl was walking to a petrol station to fill up a gas tank, and a group of teenagers sort of set about her and then set her alight after watching the film.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like a watershed moment, quite literally a watershed moment, in terms of, you know, you can't just flagrantly show things like this on TV anymore. You've got to clean up your act.
Yes. It was, I remember Fuzz. It was I think it was early 70s. That was it. So again, a lot of stuff then transferred to the cinema, you know, and water. I mean, TV was pretty bad around the time of his writing, and it really didn't start improving until stuff like Twin Peaks started coming out. I mean, there was the odd really good show, but TV was not a great medium back then. Certainly drama and horror. But we've had so many other good stuff, modern stuff. You mentioned American Horror Story, but there was also a series called Masters of Horror as well, and stuff like that recently. And of course, the one really shining star in TV horror in the 70s was Salem's Lot, in fact, I would say. And it's still quite well regarded.
Yeah, that's right.
Shall we move on to the... Well, actually, talking about TV, he then has quite a big diversion. He then moves on to horror fiction. And he has quite a long section just talking about Peter Straub's Ghost Story. Which is kind of interesting. Again, it's kind of very idiosyncratic. He spends so much time on one contemporary for that time book, but it's kind of makes you want to read it.
It was great. It was quite remarkable as well that he dedicated a lot more time to the contemporary novels than to things like The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Dracula. But I think that was all part of him wanting to get away from that scholarly thing and not wanting to cover the same ground that other people have done.
Yeah. To be honest, though, I think he did cover Dracula and Jekyll really nicely, but in a very concise way.
Yeah, everything he said was valid, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I found his comments about Straub were really interesting. It's in, I believe, after this, I can't remember if it was during this or I think it was after this, they collaborated on a book called The Talisman, which I've not read, but I'm kind of keen to get to at some point, obviously. And he also spends quite a bit of time after Ghost Story talking about something I've already mentioned, The Bad Place, the haunted house. He talks about The Shining. He talks about Salem's Lot as being an example of the bad, the Marsden House being the bad place. But he talks about various haunted house novels. Certainly The Haunting in the Hill House. I'm trying to think. Did he mention Legend of Hill House? I can't remember now.
I don't remember him mentioning that unless he did it in passing. But then I think the novels that he does dedicate to it give it a really good representation.
Yes, certainly The Haunting in the Hill House. He talks about weird angles, doesn't he? And he goes back to H.P. Lovecraft again, and how weird geometries influence a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's writing, impossible angles and things like that, which is kind of cool. And he talks about Rosemary's Baby too, and it's kind of really nice to get a history of the writing of Rosemary's Baby and realising how Ira Levin wrote it, trying to pin it down to the day, and he was writing it to happen on a certain day and it happened to be the Pope was visiting New York that day, and all of this. It's kind of really cool. And then he goes on to Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers. Not a book I've read. I've seen all three. I haven't seen. There's 4 versions in film of this story. And I haven't seen the last one. I think the last one had Nicole Kidman in it. I think it was called Invasion or something. I haven't seen that one, but I've seen the first 3 versions. And there's something about this book that I found kind of interesting that Stephen King didn't pick up, which is the entire book is almost all the other books so far are kind of, a lot of them are Apollonian versus Dionysian issues, whereas this one is almost like a story about when you lose the Dionysian part of the humanity, you become inhuman.
Yeah, that was really quite explicit in that one. I think that's it. That was why I was so intrigued about the Finney text, because it was just set in this idyllic sort of American town where you couldn't quite put your finger on what was wrong. Yeah,
and it's not something King explicitly mentions, but it is effectively you remove the Dionysian, you lose humanity, kind of thing. But I mean, King did well develop the idea of the balance between the two, being the essence of it, a lot of stories. So it's kind of cool. It then talks about something Wicked This Way Comes as a text, which is one I haven't read, but I really want to. It sounds really intriguing, actually. especially when it gives us a bit of like the biography of Bradbury around the story too. And then it gets on to probably one of my favourite sci-fi stories in both film and print, which is Shrinking Man. And it again, he took some ideas in this that really struck home to me, which is the idea that it's actually about the stages you might go through when you're bereaved, or you'll find you've got a terminal illness. You know, disbelief, anger, bargaining, acceptance, and the whole story is about that. Even though, you know, that idea hadn't been developed at that time, or it wasn't explicit to the writer. It's kind of an interesting. Is it a book you're going to be seeking out?
Definitely, it sounds like one of the most intriguing ones there, and it sounds like something that, you know, Kafka could have written, or could have sort of featured much earlier in the 20th century. It's got
indeed, it's
almost classic feel to it. What that story.
Yeah, indeed, its elements are kind of do remind you of Metamorphosis, like Kafka's Metamorphosis. So yeah, good spot actually. Yeah, it's a book I've read several times, and I really do like it a lot. But it's interesting that reading what King says about it is Matheson doesn't really attribute much to it at all. You know, he kind of thinks of it, doesn't think much of it, thinks it's kind of throwaway. King imbues a lot more significance to the book than the original author.
It can happen that way sometimes. I mean, I remember even yourself, you remarked on how King doesn't really think a lot of Carrie, but actually when you go back and read Carrie, it's an excellent book, isn't it? So yeah. I think sometimes the biggest critic of a work created it, and I think sometimes that can even be healthy because it makes you strive to want to create something better all the time.
It's kind of interesting how all this ties to King actually gives a definition of art, doesn't he, in this book? And what we're talking about now kind of ties to that. What is it? I've forgotten it now. It's something like art is when you get more out of it than you put in. I can't remember it now. That's annoying.
Yeah, when I think when the audience receives more from something, actually participate into it.
And it's kind of what we're talking about is exactly that, is it?
Yeah, definitely. And you know, that's a big part of literary criticism, even though King's quite negative about that field himself. I think he protests too much sometimes. I think he is part of it himself.
Yeah. And then he spends a bit of time talking about British authors. He talks about Ramsey Campbell, who I had never really read anything by, though because of this book I've always been meaning to, but just never got around to it. He's an author that isn't, I don't think, that significant, certainly in the sort of popular zeitgeist anymore at all. And he was never that big anyway, I don't think. But his ideas and his stories sound very, very intriguing. Especially there's one mention called Croatoan.
That's right. Yeah, about the abortion sort of
that live in the sewers.
Yeah, that sounded. Even said, didn't he, the writing style that featured in that tale was really arresting. So it was something that prospective writers should look at, even if the story itself doesn't appeal to them.
Yeah. It's certainly. I think I'm going to have to dig out some Ramsey Campbell. In fact, I think I've found a couple of his books in like a second-hand bookshop and bought them, and I've got them somewhere, but I don't know where they are. And then he comes on to James Herbert. Now, James Herbert was definitely big when this book, certainly in Britain, and I think he wasn't that big in the States, which is why King liked his style. And Herbert's definitely a sort of grand writer in terms of, you know, he'll go for the jugular. It's not subtle at all. I'm not going to say it's pulp, though a lot of people call it pulp. But I do remember being at school and we'd pass around James Herbert's The Rats because it was really grim and horrible. Yeah, and it's something we could like freak each other out over and talk about. And The Fog was much the same. He talks about The Fog at length in this, doesn't he? And how it kind of ties to the EC Comics horror as well as sort of mainstream horror in some of his sort of vignettes in the story. It's a book I read a few times actually, but I haven't read any James Herbert for a long time. But I kind of like his writing style. It's very, very clear and nicely written piece of work. It is pulp horror though, what he writes really.
Yeah, I think he upset a few people's sensibilities, Herbert, because it was so graphically violent and so excessively violent. But it has its place ultimately. I mean, we're talking about a genre where you're going to get death and you're going to get destruction. So, you know, it might not be the greatest example of writing in the field, but James Herbert was a name that I was really familiar with. He was a massive writer in this country, and a lot of people were really sad to see him go, and he died a couple of years ago too.
Yeah, I was sad. He's brought a lot of enjoyment to me personally, you know, reading various books. I haven't read all of his books, but I've read quite a few. I'd say five or six, and I kind of enjoyed him. Actually, probably more than that. And I always thought he was. And I've seen him in interviews and stuff like that, and he always seemed a very decent kind of man, you know, and knew what he was trying to achieve and got on with it. And he had some quite horrible critics, as King does, you know.
Did you find it interesting when he was talking about the couple of instances in Herbert's The Fog that seemed really quite prophetic? So the mass suicide scene in Bournemouth, that seemed to be a forewarning of the Jonestown massacre. And then there was a part which obviously King wouldn't have known about in The Fog, where someone actually drives a jumbo jet into a London skyscraper.
Yeah, that was chilling. I mean, the Jonestown massacre kind of, you know, when I read the book the first time, that kind of struck me then. So in rereads, it doesn't strike me anymore. But the jumbo jet thing is definitely. I've read the book a couple of times since 9/11, but the first time I read it, it was like, oh my god, you know, it was kind of it was kind of. It was prophetic and it was kind of tragic, and it's weird how sometimes these books, you know, real life reflects these books, as happened with Stephen King's Rage, you know.
Yeah, I think that's one sort of thing you've got to compliment these writers with, is even if they're not your favourites, they understand, they've got a really deep and intuitive understanding of what people are capable of doing.
Yeah, and tapping into our phobias as well. Yeah. And then finally, King starts talking about Harlan Ellison, who's an interesting man. I do love the story about where they asked him to go and pitch for the Star Trek film.
That was great, yeah.
He's a man to be admired, and I do want to read. There is one book mentioned that I think I'd really like to read of his, called The Glass Teat, where he talks about, I think, TV. Harlan Ellison, I've read a few of his short stories. Very good writer, but I haven't read any more than that. And he's written loads. He's famous for what's considered maybe by many the best Star Trek episode ever, The City on the Edge of Forever. Though it was heavily changed, and he wasn't happy about that. I know that because in his original draft, I think he had something like McCoy selling drugs, you know, things like that, which there's no way is that going to get into Star Trek. But he had some interesting ideas. But he also fed into the Outer Limits, and he some of the greatest stories in the Outer Limits. And I've watched all of the Outer Limits. I'm quite a fan of the show, though it's kind of dated. He wrote some of the best episodes of that too, so he is a solid writer. I know that. And then finally, he talks about how horror. No, not finally. There's a whole section at the end where he talks about The Stand, but he does talk about how horror is a reaffirmation of life, and how it's like it's often a reflection of morality plays, you know, and the good guys win, and you know, and things like that, which I find kind of interesting. That kind of is really what horror is. Really, they are archetypal morality plays, often, not always, but often.
Yeah, I think it's strange when people are asking Stephen King, does he feel bad about what he's doing? Because at no point does it ever really feel like he's justifying some of the horrible things that happen in his text. He is just presenting a world where things go wrong, and the ultimate purpose is to try and get them back to normal and to a more moral state.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't think in any of his books does like the bad win. It's always, the good. It's always an affirmation of goodness. If you think about it or Salem's Lot or The Shining, there's some sort of proper old-fashioned resolution to his stories.
Yeah, I think that makes it just even more perplexing when people do throw those sort of accusations at him. And that you're right, they're definitely morality tales. And even if there is a pervading sense of dread at the end of the book, it's never usually like the innocent characters that suffer. I mean, one of the most jarring things with Kubrick's version of The Shining was the fact that Dick Halloran actually gets murdered, whereas in the book, he's central to Danny and Wendy getting away from the place.
Yeah, indeed. King is an old school storyteller, I think. He wants the good guys to win in the end, and that kind of becomes obvious. And like I say, I can't think of a single work of King's where that isn't true. Possibly in the short stories, as a twist. But in terms of his novels, it doesn't work like that at all. And usually, if it is a short story with a twist, it's a bad guy that's getting what he deserves from something even worse. So, even then it's fine. Kind of thing. Then King has this kind of really interesting afterword where he talks about real life horror versus sort of fictional horror, kind of by giving examples. But then it goes into what fed into the writing of The Stand.
Yeah, the Stand's an interesting one because he talks about how it was sort of too irresistible for him not to write about, destroying the world and starting anew. Yeah. And he said that even with The Stand, it's one of the few things that ends on a more sombre note, as if people are going to make the same mistakes over again. But even then, the general tension of that novel to me feels like getting something back to a more normal state.
Yeah, it's I really found it interesting to find what was his influences into The Stand. It was like what is it? Patty Hearst was one, and he'd read a book about, I think, called This Silent Earth or something like that, about how the Earth would start regenerating if people weren't around and stuff like that, and that all feeds into The Stand, and it's kind of cool.
There was that good anecdote as well that he saw in the news too about how there was a superbug that killed loads of sheep in a field, and that if the wind had been blowing a different way that day, then Salt Lake City would have been in serious trouble.
Yes. Yeah, so they all fed into it, and I think the oil crisis. I mean, the oil crisis comes up again and again. Actually, in some of the works I've done before this, it's certainly mentioned in Roadwork, which is what I did last month, and they all kind of slot in together. It's kind of cool, and it basically by ending the book like that, it's showing you this is not an academic work. It's not a thorough. It's just me shooting the shit about this kind of stuff. Take it or leave it, and it's a thoroughly enjoyable book. Personally, this is my favourite piece of non-fiction.
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of valid claim. I think I might prefer On Writing marginally just because of how much it has helped me in the past. But I also think this is going to have a massive kind of effect on me in terms of not just pursuing new works of horror, but understanding them a little bit more as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me it didn't just help me with the horror. It helps me with genre cinema, and what used to be called drive-in cinema or low budget cinema, to sort of understand that sometimes you can't expect quality. You got to look elsewhere to find some benefits, and I think also the contrast helps you appreciate the good stuff even more. I think that's an important thing about sort of lower rent films and books and so on. Absolutely,
not everything can be Citizen Kane, can it?
Yeah, and if it was, you wouldn't appreciate Citizen Kane.
Definitely.
That's the point. Okay, I think I'm about done in terms of Stephen King's Danse Macabre. How about you?
I think that was a really enjoyed the discussion because it felt, I I got through the book fairly quickly, but by the end of it, I had that classic feeling of it being over. It just felt like such an enjoyable ride through a whole genre, and it didn't even feel like it only focused on 30 years. It did feel like it covered the whole thing.
Yeah, you felt like you got all the key elements of everything about horror, really.
No, definitely, yeah.
There was that feeling. It made you think. It made me think, if he did version 2 of this and incorporated more recent stuff, books and films and stuff like that would be so awesome to read again.
It's not something you could put past him, really, with the rate that he turns books out at. So, yeah.
I'm just reaching here. Hold on, I'm just getting something. I've actually got the audiobook I mentioned. Got this off Amazon. It was pretty cheap actually, and it's like 15 discs and it's 16 hours, and it's narrated by William DeFries. I could definitely recommend it. It's the unabridged version, so it's the exact text. It's a really good listen if ever any of our listeners have got a long drive or something like that, and you want to sort of experience this book. But having said that, it's a great book to read as well, because you can actually make notes about what books you want to read, and as Charlie mentioned, there's appendices at the back that are really worth having a look at and going through and adding to your Netflix queue or your Amazon Prime queue or your Amazon rental queue or whatever. They're really worth looking at. Okay then, shall we'll wind it up there.
Oh, that was really enjoyable. Thanks for having me on, and I look forward to potentially speaking about more Stephen King with you in the future, Mark.
That'd be excellent. Would you like to mention your podcast again, so listeners can have a listen to you and Scott?
Yeah, basically we can be found on Facebook and Twitter under The Stinking Pools. We've also got a website, stinkingpools.com, which lists all the previous episodes and descriptions of what we've done, and we're available on iTunes as well. So, anyone who wants to give us a listen and send us some feedback would be very welcome.
Okay then, I'd have to say goodbye from me.
And bye from me. Cheers.
This guy and his girl go out on a date, and they go parking up on Lover's Lane. So anyway, while they're driving up there, the radio breaks in with this bulletin. The guy says this dangerous homicidal maniac named The Hook has just escaped from the Sunnydale Asylum for the criminally insane. They call him The Hook because that's what he's got instead of a right hand. This razor-sharp hook. And he used to hang around these lovers' lanes, and he'd catch these people making out and cut their heads off with the hook. He could do that because it was so sharp, And when they caught him, they found like 15 or 20 heads in his refrigerator. So the news guy says to be on the lookout for any guy with a hook instead of a hand, and to stay away from any dark, lonely spots where people go to, get it on. So the girl says, "Let's go home, okay?" And the guy, he's this real big guy, with muscles on his muscles. He says, "I'm not scared of that guy. He's probably miles from here anyway." So she goes, "Come on, Louie, I'm scared. Sunnydale Asylum isn't that far from here. Let's go back to my house. I'll make popcorn and we can watch TV." But the guy won't listen to her. And pretty soon they're up on the Outlook, parked at the end of the road, making out like banditos. But she keeps saying she wants to go home because they're the only car there, That stuff about the hook scared away everybody else. But he keeps saying, "Come on, don't be such a chicken. There's nothing to be afraid of, and if there was, I'd protect you." Stuff like that. So they keep making out for a while, and then she hears a noise, like a breaking branch or something. Like someone is out there in the woods, creeping up on them. So then she gets real upset, hysterical, crying everything, like girls do. She's begging the guy to take her home. The guy keeps saying he doesn't hear anything at all, but she looks up in the rearview mirror and thinks she sees someone all hunkered down at the back of the car, just peeking in at them and grinning. She says if he doesn't take her home, she's never going to go out parking with him again and all that happy-crappy. So finally he starts up the car and really peels out because he's so jacked off at her. In fact, he just about cracks them up. So anyway, they get home, and the guy goes around to open her door for her. And when he gets there, he just stands there, turning as white as a sheet, and his eyes are getting so big you'd think they was going to fall out on his shoes. She says, "Louie, what's wrong?" And he just faints dead away right there on the sidewalk. She gets out to see what's wrong, And when she slams the car door, she hears this funny clinking sound and turns around to see what it is. And there, hanging from the door handle, is this razor-sharp hook.